this may be for real.
Eyeball. Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of the program. We've been on a bit of a hiatus. This is our first program that we've taped since March of 2020 before the COVID shutdown. And so it's great to get the band back together, so to speak. And so one of our regulars is Denise Keele on my right. Denise is a professor in the political science department at Western Michigan University. She is also affiliated with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. She is also the chair of the WMU Working Group on Climate Change, and she also sort of serves as I don't know if it's an official title, but you are the chair of the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition also.
So, I know.
Yeah, so it takes up half the program just to introduce Denise. But great to be back with you. Don Cooney normally is with us, but Don is out doing some public service today and is also engaged in a campaign for office. So we have an outstanding guest star to come in with us today, and that's Paul Clements. Paul is a professor in the political science department at Western Michigan University also. And back in the day, Paul and I, along with Dave Crow, sort of cooked up the idea for having a working group on climate change, which Denise chairs so ably today. So welcome. It's a little strange being back after such a long time, but there's certainly no shortage of things to talk about. Denise, any thoughts about the COVID shutdown and how you've been dealing with it? And
Wow. Well, thanks, Ron. Thank you, Paul, for being here. We missed Don today. I'm very glad to see Public Media Network open and our technical staff able to make this happen today. Wow, a year and a half. I feel like we're very privileged. I was able to continue to work from home and do a lot of what we're able to do virtually. But my goodness, over 700,000 Americans have passed, and it's so difficult now with vaccines to continue to see the surges in what could have been preventable deaths. So it's, being in a pandemic is, what do they say? You want to live in interesting times? We sure are living in interesting times, those of us that have been able to manage this last year and a half.
And I think at some point, we're not going to talk about it today, but I think at some point we want to come back and do a special show on COVID. Paul, your thoughts about the COVID shutdown? I've seen a lot of you on Zoom meetings from your living room.
Well, like you say, Denise, I've been glad that I can just keep teaching my classes and just wearing the mask and all. I feel like, and even working from home, that we're among the fortunate ones in all this. And it's so sad that it was so terribly mismanaged that we didn't have to have far more deaths than any other country in the world.
Preventable deaths, indeed. Well, again, COVID looms over everything, obviously, and the reason why we're back after such a long period of time, because we were shut down by the global pandemic, but there's still no shortage of things to focus on. And what we wanted to focus on, particularly with this first program back, is the upcoming Conference of Parties number 26, which is going to take place in Glasgow, Scotland, starting on October 31st. And the Conference of Parties, as people probably know, has to do with international groups who try to deal with the climate change issue. Denise, you want to tell us a little bit more about COP26 and the COP process in general and what's going to happen in Glasgow?
Sure. I'll take the enviable role of some of the history here on what is another preventable catastrophe, right? If we really think about some of the parallels here, depending on how you count, at least 50 years, we've known what's happening and perhaps what we should be doing about it. The Conference of the Parties technically is year 25, right? That's why it's COP26. But I would go back in time just a little bit. 1972 is the first UN conference on human and environment. It's a very short 2-page declaration, and it says all the things that we still need to say today, right? We knew that then. 1988 is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they produced their first report, Our Common Future, which actually holds up. It's a like 500-page text on climate change, what we knew then. It holds up today, again, with the technical solutions and the understanding of the science. In 1992, of course, we signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the overall international governing body that was under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. You know, a very proud moment for Bush signing us on to a voluntary international agreement to reduce our emissions. And then that's followed in 1995 in Berlin as the first true conference of the parties to start working on what kind of things are we going to actually do as an international community. The first launch of that is Kyoto, which I think most folks are familiar with that, in 1997. And as we were talking before the show, that's the Clinton administration, which of course the Senate unanimously says no, right? And they do so for 2 reasons. It's going to cost the economy too much, and what about these other countries? So the US can't be expected to do all this stuff if everyone else isn't also doing that. So these conferences go on, right, with 25 years of knowing what the problem is, what the solutions are, and who the players should be. I remember doing the 2015 Paris Agreement show and how maybe optimistic I was because it really tried to rectify 2 of those original problems with Kyoto. It says everybody is in this together, and every country has to make its determined contributions to climate change. So there's no more of the US argument that China and India and everybody's doing their fair share. And it also was at a time of an economic consensus that was going to cost more to deal with climate change, and that we should move that forward. So Paris does help us over some obstacles, particularly for the United States, to participate. But of course, the 1.5 degree aspirational and 2 degree target, why is this so important, right? After 25 or 50 years, depending on how you want to count, we've already increased global temperatures 1.1 degree. If our goal is 1.5, we have lost many opportunities to act. And here is, again, presented with, we know what to do. It is about these kinds of commitments. And from our science, we know that even quarters of degree matter. They matter to all of the impacts of droughts and heat waves and species. So it is way past time to act. And I'll let Paul jump in and fill in some of the gaps there, I think.
Paul,
Sure.
you've studied a lot of the international political community's efforts to deal with this, so anything you can add to the context here in terms of the importance of this particular COP?
Yeah, I certainly would be happy to jump in here. I think that when we think about the very basic problem of climate change, that in these international negotiations and equally in our national politics, that the fundamental challenge has been this question of responsibility.
Yes.
That we have a situation where we all know that this carbon pollution comes from burning fossil fuels that people do to make their profit and to live a good life. But we've known now for many decades that when we burn that fossil fuel, that we create problems that when it gets to where it is today, that it's killing people, that it's causing extinctions of species, and these deaths and people having to leave their homes due to drought and due to rising sea level, that is all due to the pleasure that we have, the lifestyle that we have from our industrialization. Right. And from the very beginning, the first, you talked about 1992 when they started the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was the first time we got all the countries of the world together to say, what are we going to do about this? And they actually said at that time that we need to get our greenhouse gas emissions by 2000 down below what they were in 1992. That's in that document. And United States, we signed on to it. But what we found is that those who benefit from these greenhouse gas emissions, from this pollution, that they haven't been willing to take that responsibility, and they've been using their financial power in many cases to block further movements. So when we look at these COP meetings, the developing countries, they've always said, look, United States, you've contributed more greenhouse gases than any other country. And although China's ahead of us now at the national level, the United States is still ahead in terms of our
historical cumulative emissions. We're number one.
Exactly, exactly. And so the question becomes then, well, when that's causing sea level rise, drought, forest fires, et cetera, particularly in those developing countries that didn't cause the problem, right? Then what responsibility are we going to take? And from the very beginning in the UNFCCC from 1992, I think the fundamental problem has been that the advanced countries have resisted any kind of legal responsibility through the system for the harms we're causing from our carbon pollution. So, you mentioned that the Paris Agreement 2015 was a great accomplishment, and it was, to get all the different countries of the world on board. But I think we also need to recognize that in order to do that, what we had to give up was to say, all right, now each individual country is going to just make up their own nationally determined contribution. And it's just whatever you want to do, with no, even at that time, there was no consistent monitoring, with no sanctions for not doing it. So it's still, well, if you've been emitting lots of greenhouse gases and you want to cut down, well, you can if you want to, just as much as you want to do.
Right.
And I'm delighted that we're still moving the process forward. But as we move the process forward, the problem has just been getting worse and worse. We said back in 1992 that we want to get our greenhouse gases down below 1992 by 2000. Well, they've continued to increase and increase and increase. And as a consequence of that, the harms that we're imposing now that we've seen across the world, but particularly on future generations, are just getting worse and worse. So I'm kind of on a soapbox here, but I'm going to keep up with the fundamental issue, and that is to say that if we're going to have real responsibility at the national level and at the subnational level, I think that what that's going to require is some kind of stronger international agreements where each country has to make cuts that are somehow proportionate to their contribution of the harm, that they've got to contribute to the solution. If you're killing people in other countries, then you have a responsibility. If you're causing people to lose their homes in other countries, then you have a responsibility to either help them find a new place to live, or in some cases with migration, to accept some of those migrants into your own countries. And this is, you look at the Paris Agreement, these nationally determined contributions, what the countries did not want to do is they did not want to subject themselves to any accountability. And what that accountability would mean, in effect, let's be serious, it's a loss of national sovereignty. It's saying that we have to do something due to the global situation that some global international organization that we're part of, but that it can impose sanctions on us if we don't do that. And I appreciate that loss of national sovereignty is not a popular thing politically. I'm a political science professor, but there's frankly no other solution. And so what I'm sure that when we look at what's going to happen in Glasgow, in our COP26, this meeting coming up in November, that we'll see a few countries making some commitments here and there. We're not going to see enough commitments to get us anywhere close to 2 degrees Celsius. And I don't think we're going to see commitments that bring us closer to real responsibility, real accountability, and that's the fundamental issue.
Yeah, it's worth noting, Paul, what you bring up. So we've had 5 years post-Paris, and this idea of each country being able to determine its own contribution towards addressing the climate crisis was a political solution, right? To keep the U.S. on board even during the Obama administration. I mean, that was the reason because we have such a powerful influence. And there's actually every year now the UN emissions gap report that I know you know very well. That is telling us, well, that's not working, right? The nationally determined contributions, again, go home and figure out what you can do and bring us your best deal. we know that that's not working, and the current contributions, things that countries say they are doing, there's currently only one country, by the way, that even gets close to 1.5, and it is like Somalia, okay? Because, right, like these are folks who are actually doing things, as you noted, who didn't cause the problem. But the emissions gap report, if countries right now, what they've said they could do to combat climate change, if they did all of that, we would still be on a trajectory to at least 4 degrees Celsius rise. So the gap, right, between 2 and 4 is real. And that's, again, if, I don't know about you, I make a list every day. I didn't accomplish everything on my list. That's if I did everything I said I was going to do and did it perfect. So I think, when I looked at the sort of goal for COP26, it leaves me with a little lack of luster as well, Paul. The goal is keep hope alive, is the main theme of the conference, and to really have to get the leverage that every country has to come up with a better plan to cut emissions, right? Number one. And number two, the funding aspect. Then that's where the responsibility part has always come in and has always been such an intractable thing. But we have to also increase those monetary contributions from the countries who can to solve some of the adaptation issues, to deal with the 1.1 degree, likely 1.5 that we're already committed to. So this gap is really, really important, and having a goal to keep hope alive and to further cut emissions, and about 11 countries, the EU has come up with a little bit more plan, but that's where we are. So what can happen in these 2 weeks?
Denise, when you bring up the financial issue, I think that that's really fundamental to keeping all the countries of the world on board.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Because when it comes down to responsibility, and if we're causing these floods and droughts, if the advanced countries predominantly were the cause for these droughts and floods, which are most seriously impacting people in the developing countries, then their position all the way along has been, why should we lose our chance to industrialize,
right,
or make it so much harder for us if you don't help us to deal with these problems that you're causing? Mm-hmm. And so way back in 2009, the advanced countries, Hillary Clinton went to that COP in Copenhagen,
that's right,
and said, we're going to commit $100 billion a year, right, by 2009. She's, by 2020.
Yeah.
She put it off for 11 years,
right,
all right? And this was all supposed to be through and then what came to be understood as a green climate
That's right,
fund,
yeah,
that would then be using those resources. And then in Paris, they agreed that it should be roughly 50-50
mm-hmm,
between mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, adapting to the
That's right,
effects of these things, where the advanced countries help the developing countries to get through. And this has been what the developing countries has been, this is what
Yep,
we need to see.
that's right.
Well, okay, so the first thing that has happened here is we haven't reached that 100 billion. That the most recent data, I think, was from 2019. They said 87 billion. But even more fundamental than that is that instead of going to the Green Climate Fund, only about 10 billion has gone to the Green Climate Fund, and the other 77 billion has been through all the different bilateral, multilateral, through 30 different funding organizations, which mostly are controlled by the advanced countries. Yeah. And then when they did that, then they also said, well, this is supposed to be new and additional money.
Right, that's right. Mm-hmm.
But the way they do the accounting is a lot of these countries say, well, we used to give all this development assistance, and now we're just going to take some of that old development assistance and put it into this new pot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they say it's 87 billion, but if you just look at what's new and additional, although you can't do the math exactly,
right,
it probably is looking closer to like 50 billion.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, since 2015, the newer science is
Yeah,
telling us that the harms are even worse,
that's right,
than what they were based upon at, what we're seeing in 2015.
And happening faster.
And happening faster. And so that $100 billion is nowhere near enough.
Right.
And we're nowhere close to that. So it'll be interesting in Glasgow to see, I have no doubt that the developing countries will be saying, well, look, if you want us to take this seriously,
yeah,
then show us the money. And if they don't come up with a more serious process that takes us beyond 100 billion, I don't see getting the full cooperation from the developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to add a couple of other things into the mix here that I think are going to be important. and that is, we can talk about the nation state and historical cumulative emissions, and of course, as you mentioned, China has passed us in terms of current emissions. But it's also important to point to what are called the carbon majors, right? These are specific organizations that have contributed a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions over time. Mostly they're corporations in the fossil fuel industry. Some are state-run oil and gas industries. But the research by Richard Heady and others says that there are about 90 carbon majors that have contributed 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions, going back to 1751, going back to, around the start of the industrial era. And so what's important about these carbon majors, of course, is the tremendous political clout that they have and the economic resources, which you alluded to earlier, Paul, that they have. And so this is actually, when we talk about what certain countries are going to do and the COP process, we have to understand that they're heavily influenced by these carbon majors, these corporations in the fossil fuel industry. And many of them have switched from being overt deniers and funding the Heartland Institute and others. They're probably still shoveling dark money in there as best they can hide it. But many of them have adopted a different stance. This is the new corporation that Joel Barkan talks about in his new book, that claim to be environmentally and socially conscious, who claim to be working on these issues. And of course, a lot of that is just greenwash, right? It's not. But even if they're sincere, these corporations are not going to do what has to be done because it contradicts the fundamental purpose for which these organizations are created. I mean, they'll do good as long as they can also make a profit, but they're not going to do good if they can't profit. And so that limits what their governments can do if the governments are still in this kind of relationship with these corporations. I talk about state-corporate crime in my own research a lot, or state-corporate relationships, and so I think that's really important. And unfortunately, corporations, the new corporation guys are there. They're going to be there. They'll be all over the process. They'll set up booths, and their representatives will be there. And very often, representatives from the broader social movement are then shut out. And the corporate influence, in the guise of being the new socially conscious corporation, is there exerting a heavier influence. So that will be one thing I would look for. What's going to happen.
You've really hit the nail on the head with that, Ron, that if we look at why did the Kyoto fail back in 1998, and you documented this in your book, that it was because the U.S. companies that were, the fossil fuel companies, the big businesses that make millions of dollars off fossil fuels, that they funded a massive lobbying effort to get those 100% of votes against, in the Senate, that then blocked the Kyoto Agreement. And if we look at every step along the way since then, we have these governments, and the rules have to come from governments. The negotiations are going to have to come from governments. But the governments are so heavily influenced by the fossil fuel companies, the big businesses that make enormous profits from this, and they know the game. I mean, they've been playing this game for long before climate change, how to get government policies that protect their profits. And that's their fundamental priority. And frankly, the challenge has been that the people who are most heavily impacted, the low-income people in developing countries, the marginal people in the United States, people in predominantly in communities of color who are more subject, like if we look at New Orleans, who got hurt the most there, that they don't have the political power compared to these big companies. And I want to say that this is really kind of a fundamental sort of structural issue, that we have environmental organizations, League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Climate Hawks, that do what they can to push the politics, but their power is tiny compared to the decades and billions of dollars of power of these big oil companies. And that's the fundamental reason that we failed to make the progress so far. And if we look at who's standing behind the governments as they come together, look at Australia.
Yes.
That they've been they're still the biggest coal exporter in the world. And I think Queen Elizabeth had to sort of twist the arm of the Prime Minister of Australia to even get him to come.
That's right.
To Glasgow. Because they still want to make, the government of Australia is basically representing the coal carbon interests in Australia, and they're not going to move forward under this prime minister, under this situation. So the question then becomes, how do we get our middle classes? How do we get our professionals, our retired people, our young people, not just to go out into the streets and protest? We need that. By all means, we need people to go out and protest, but we need to also build that political power that can counter the power of these big corporations in Congress. Let's say for West Virginia, when we have sort of, well, I know you're going to talk about this later, when Joe Manchin is running for his next election, that's where the power needs to be built and the power needs to be applied, plus internationally in the same respect.
Yeah. Well, Ron, to your point, the good news and the bad news about Paris, it's a really interesting new mechanism in international treaties like this. Anyone can sign on to Paris. It doesn't have to just be a sovereign country that says we're committed to the goal, right? We know that that's what we need. But what Paris did was also open the door and say, businesses, you can sign on. Cities like Kalamazoo have done that. The state of Michigan, there's like 20 states in Michigan have said, we're going to also work towards the Paris goals. But the fundamental problem of power exists. And even with all of those different folks signing on saying, yeah, we're into this, there's no accountability. So it's very difficult to tell which one of those 70 businesses, as you know, have contributed to 90% of the carbon emissions are actually doing anything. And so without any sort of follow-up or accountability, it could be a great thing that we opened this door, right? Everybody could sign on to the Paris Agreement, and you too could help your business or organization or state or school, right, reach this certain goal. But that power is nothing compared to those corporate actors. And I think it's no surprise you mentioned Australia. It's no surprise that Putin, Russia, is he's not going. I know we're shocked at that. As China, I know India's prime minister just said, Modi said they're going to participate, but I think China is still up in the air as we tape this today as to whether they're actually going to come or not. So when you talk about the hegemony and the power and where these oil and gas resources are and where the corporate influence is stronger than perhaps even the states, right? Those countries are already, maybe we just won't even go. Well,
the International Energy Agency came out with this report earlier this year where they said, look, if we want to reach our 1.5 degree goal, the goal of Paris, that we need to start having no new coal-based power plants starting from this year. Well, who's the biggest producer? China. And they plan to continue adding new coal-based power plants for many years, possibly up until 2030. And when you look at their trajectory, then that locks them in to emissions that are way beyond what we can taking us far beyond the Paris targets for decades to come. But then China, again, they're going to look at us and say, well, why should we make big sacrifices if you're not doing your part?
Right.
And our part is both getting our carbon emissions down, which Biden has made some grand proposals, but as I'm sure we'll talk about later, the Congress is not following up there. But even more fundamentally, putting those resources out there and supporting those global institutions that are what we cannot solve the problem without the money and without the stronger global governance.
Well, let's switch our attention then to talk about the domestic politics, and let me try to frame this a little bit first, because one of the things that made Paris happen was that the Obama administration, with John Kerry as the Secretary of State, was able to negotiate an agreement with China in 2014.
Correct.
And that agreement was so important. If that agreement had not happened, there wouldn't have been any Paris agreement. And so we get Paris because of the hard work that John Kerry did in trying to get China on board at that point. So that's one issue. And so ultimately, there has to be some kind of China-U.S. alliance. We're not going to solve this problem unless China and the United States, the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, unless they come together and they take really strong action and take the leadership role. And even with getting China to come in, the United States role has to be first and foremost, right? And the problem is that the domestic politics prevent us from doing that, right? So that hampered Obama at Paris because they couldn't have a treaty.
Correct.
A treaty would have required Senate ratification. There was no way in the world that the Senate was going to ratify any kind of treaty because the Republican Party, wholly a subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry at this point, and some Democrats are as well, but the Republican Party was completely lockstep that they were not going to vote to approve any kind of treaty. So what Obama had to do was to kind of do this voluntary, you'd agree to make some contributions.
That's right.
And, they had to do sort of this dipsy-doodle in Paris to even get to where they got because it couldn't have been a formal treaty. It was not going to get ratified, just as Kyoto was not ratified back in the day. And so that was Obama's problem. The domestic politics were hampering him. Well, now the same thing is happening. As we head to COP26, the U.S. role has to be the preeminent role. And the rest of the world is going to follow our lead. They're not going to, China, let alone anybody else, is not going to do what they need to do unless the United States makes a strong commitment. Until we come up with some, we demonstrate, right? We're going to walk the walk. We're not just going to talk the talk. We're going to walk the walk. We're going to do some things that are substantial. And so this is where Biden's at, right? So Biden has been talking a great game. I think in some other circumstances we've talked about the way in which Biden has surprised even a lot of climate activists because of the strong stances that he's taken. But now, walking the walk, here's where we run into the problem because we can talk a little bit about executive actions that the Biden administration can take, and they've taken some, but to get the legislation through, and that's the problem. And so we have this infrastructure bill, right? We have the Build Back Better plan, and it contains some climate provisions that are critical, and yet we're stalled, right? We're stalled because the Republicans are completely unanimous that they're not going to support anything. They're just, the Republican Party is just, I don't know, it's a death machine at this point.
Is it an actual party? I'm not sure. That's a whole other conversation.
I mean, it's just absolutely not going to do anything, not going to lift one finger to help deal with the problem.
We have to reinforce that point. You use the term death machine, and the utter hypocrisy of the Republican Party that talks about personal responsibility, but they don't want to take responsibility for their own and our collective contribution to this problem. They know that, and the fact that for decades, it's true that it's been Exxon, Mobil, and the carbon companies that have been behind this, but the Republican Party has sold its soul by denying the science for decades now, the science that everyone knows, that's been very, very well established, and then by making it, as you say, like if you want to be a Republican in elected office, you cannot, you have to at least pretend not to believe in climate change, or at least you have to be against any possible bill that is addressing this issue. And I have to mention here, including our own Fred Upton, who presents himself as a moderate, but who's been even stronger against climate action over the last decade and a half. In terms of his power, what he could have done, he could have taken real action when he was chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which he failed to do. And now he says some of the right things, but you look at his actions, and he still doesn't follow up. So he's just one more of those Republicans. And every step along the way, it's been the Republican Party that's been blocking the U.S. government, And since the Republican Party blocks the US government, we can't get the international action that we need. And so when you say death machine, that's not too far off.
Absolutely not. And I think it's worth reframing the problem statement here, that Democrats really need to be out there and saying exactly this. Look, there is another whole half of the Senate, okay, that will have nothing to do with this. And why isn't more of that blame on the Republican Party, right? Where's their one vote, right? Where's their one?
To do with anything that helps the American people in any way, shape, or form.
Despite the popularity of these policies.
Almost all the proposals that are part of this package are very, very popular.
Yeah.
And yet Republicans are just lockstep. If Biden
Correct.
proposes it, just like with Obama, if Obama proposed something,
Yes.
they definitely oppose it. If Biden wants
Yep.
to do it, they have to say absolutely
Yes.
no and not vote at all. And of course, the Senate is 50-50.
That's right.
Here's our problem, right?
That's right.
So we can do some things through reconciliation.
Correct.
Right? But that means all 50 Democrats now have to come along. And here we run into the problem of Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, because we have two Democratic senators
Yep.
who have taken tremendous amounts of money from the fossil fuel industry, from the pharmaceutical industry, from other corporate benefactors, and in a sense they've become corporate mercenaries, and they're blocking the bill, the 3.5 trillion package,
Yep.
which is over 10 years, right?
Yep.
We spend $1 trillion every single year on defense, most of which is wasted and
Yep.
not related to any actual defense needs of the United States.
Yep.
But 3.5 trillion over 10 years to do all these wonderful, great things which would benefit the American people and that the American people support by
That's right.
70% margins.
That's correct.
That can't happen because Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin are playing this game. They're taking all this corporate money and now they're blocking the process. So it's going to have to be reduced in price. Now they're talking about 1.9 trillion. I mean, they may still come up with some kind of a deal
Yeah.
here. I don't know. But what's going to get cut?
Yeah.
And of course, there's lots of good things in this bill, but to our purposes today, all the climate provisions that we need
Yeah.
to be taken seriously at Glasgow are in here.
Yeah.
And if they don't pass,
We're in the exact same situation Obama was in 2009 that you just alluded to, even though Democrats technically control both houses. So I would back up and say maybe just one quick thing about the overall. Again, I think there should be more blame on the Republicans for this.
Yes.
I think that we are in a weird situation having that control and having to go through an infrastructure reconciliation budget process, so that this name of this bill, Americans don't know what that means. It's some reconciliation. Why, it has none of the names of the actual policies that they support in it. And I think that's been a very tough thing for Democrats to go out and sell, because they don't get to talk about that this is about your family's rights. This is about climate and all of these other things. They have to call it infrastructure, and no one knows what is going on. I feel like it has a terrible name, right? A terrible framing of this particular problem. So if we think about the lead up to Copenhagen and what Obama was able to do, okay, so we had a cap and trade bill in Congress that the Senate refused to take up at the last minute as Obama walks into the Copenhagen COP 21. I don't even know. I can't. You're better at math than I am. Yeah. As he and so imagine, right? What you have zero leverage in these international negotiations to walk in and say, you know what? We really need everyone to be doing better, but we're not actually going to do that, right?
And what's China going to say?
That's exactly. They're going to say, oh, well, we see you over there, U.S. And so what does Obama do after that? It says, well, okay, we're not going to get legislation, so I have to do this through executive order. And we come up with the Clean Power Plan, which is to reduce the carbon emissions from electric and coal-fired utility plants by 30% by 2030, right? And this is then the signature item that gets us into Paris, that gets us into the door, that says, oh my gosh, the U.S. is doing something, y'all, here we go. Yeah. Which then, of course, is litigated. Who is the lead plaintiff on the suit against the Clean Power Plan? West Virginia et al. It is, by the way, the same Attorney General right now, Attorney General Morrissey in West Virginia, that is blocking almost everything. So West Virginia is playing...
The Supreme Court put a hold on it.
Put a hold on that and sort of gave that up. The provision that is in the infrastructure bill, again, I wish it had a better name than that so we could sell it a little bit better.
Build back better.
Okay. But the main provision in there is something called the Clean Energy Performance Program. It is essentially the Clean Power Plan, okay? It says what we ought to do is, we ought to set national standards for utilities about how much renewable energy they get. It is the one provision in the bill that would actually cut emissions. And that is what Manchin has objected to. And the state of West Virginia has and it is now, as I understand it, scrapped from the bill. Despite the fact, folks, that 38 states already have such a standard. Okay, Michigan even has a renewable portfolio standard. It's low, it says 15% of our energy demands have to come from renewables. The median is 40, and there are, I think, 11 or 12 states that have 100% renewable energy standard. This is not something that is like radical and crazy, okay? 38 states already have this. It was a reasonable executive order that probably would have won in the courts, so who knows now. And here it is again, and it's the exact same thing that is being stopped and is going to get scrapped out of that bill. Today at the White House, Sunrise Movement, our youth are on a hunger strike outside President Biden's office, started Wednesday. And I'm like, you're targeting the wrong maybe person, but they're saying, look, if this bill doesn't have this stuff in it, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And we're in the same situation going into a COP26. Oh gosh, are we going to get this legislation? Maybe not. Are we going to end up with an executive order in March to right just what happened in 2009? And here we are, another 10 years that we could have been addressing the climate crisis in the ways that we already know how and ending the suffering that you're talking about so eloquently, Paul.
Joe Manchin, he made his fortune off the coal industry. That's where his millions of dollars come from, and he's been playing this West Virginia politics, as we know, for a long time. And so he has been, he personally is blocking this clean electricity performance program that is the central, the most significant piece of the entire climate legislation that's moving forward.
That's right.
I'm going to it's no surprise that this current COP is taking place in Glasgow. I had the chance to go to a climate justice conference in Glasgow about 3 years ago. And what I learned is that Scotland, UK is not doing so well, but Scotland, within UK, that they, in fact, all their electricity is 97% carbon neutral today. Already. And so they've had a political process because, the people of Scotland figured out in 2009 that this is something they need to get behind. This is really important, that for justice, for their role in the international community, for their just sense of self-respect, that they want to be part of the solution to this. And they've been building up their government systems to support businesses, to support households, moving to clean energy. They want to be carbon neutral by 2030 for the whole country. All right, that's incredible. So you can do it if you have the right broad public support. And Joe Manchin and West Virginia are emblematic of the reason that we cannot do it, that we're not going to, that we will not get the signature item that we need to demonstrate United States credibility. And so again, Biden's going to have to go to Glasgow with basically his pants down. Sorry.
Yeah, even though he says he'll be wearing bells, with bells on, but there's nothing to back that up. And Michael Mann tweeted yesterday, I think, what Joe Manchin has done is just launched a grenade into the Glasgow process, right?
And I don't want us to forget Kristen Sinema, because this is a little more politically complicated.
Good point.
All right, because she has not sort of been against the climate change provisions. What she's been against is any kind of increase on taxes on the rich.
Yeah.
All right, but let's recognize what this really means. Okay, that everyone knows that the Trump administration dramatically cut taxes on the rich, and that for us to solve any of the basic social problems that we face as a country, that it just makes sense for us to do that. It's very, very popular politically.
Right.
But Kristen Sinema says, all right, she's not going to support any bill that increases taxes. Well, but the reality is that to do these other programs, they're going to cost something. And so that's a sort of a behind the scenes approach that then actually undermines, because everyone else is going to say, well, if this bill can't achieve some of my core objectives, why would I support it?
Right.
And so even though she's not making speeches against climate action, she's undermining the conditions that we need in order to move forward on climate action.
And she's just playing this sort of coy game where
Yep.
she won't even really come out and say what her objections are.
Right.
I mean, we know that that's one of them, but we just haven't. I mean, she's just. I don't understand. And she started as a member of the Green Party in
That's right.
Arizona, and to get to the position right now where she's teaming up with Joe Manchin, a tag team, to wreck COP26.
I mean, Joe Manchin, at least he's been consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's been consistent in his
Consistently bad.
Exactly. But she just, I mean, does she have any principles?
It doesn't. It's hard to figure out what they are.
Yeah.
That's why it's easy for politicians to talk about this price tag versus the substance of what's in this actual bill. And again, this is this framing problem of having it to go through this reconciliation and calling it infrastructure. She gets to go out there and just argue that, well, that's a lot of money, and that's okay. Like that's the only thing publicly she said, and she's doesn't talk about any of the substance here. And the White House, the last press conferences and because they're worried about exactly what you're talking about, Paul. So are the left progressives going to also now not vote for this thing? And they're getting lots of pressure from Sunrise and from their constituents to say, well, it doesn't have the major thing in there, so can we even vote for this thing at all?
Yeah,
and I saw the White House press release secretary, their main headline is, there are many paths to 2030, because Biden's goal has been 50% reduction by 2030, and that's below 2005 levels, right? So there are many paths to that. Which are mostly those subsidies for renewables and EVs and electric cars, which still includes subsidies to oil and gas.
There's
if you
a
really
lot
want
of tax
to
credits
get
for
start
renewables in there.
tax credits, and one of the arguments to keep the progressives on board is that all that money that was going to take to do the Clean Energy Performance Program, that'll get shifted into all these cool, incentivized programs that you want, and then it's classic trickle down because then the state will get that money, and then Kalamazoo would get that money, and y'all are going to be able to do this anyways. And it's sort of like, no, that's great, right? And those incentives ought to be there, but without some signature standard that actually reduces emissions, this is not going to get us anywhere close to even our listed contribution, right?
Yeah.
It's the electricity sector that needs to go first, and that's what this bill would do.
That's right.
That we know that to retrofit all of our houses off of natural gas and from gas burners is going to take forever.
Yep.
And steel and cement and some of this big industry, these are hard sells.
That's right.
But solar and wind is already cheaper than coal. And electricity, we need to be moving rapidly to where we're powering everything from electricity, and it's actually pretty efficient.
Yep.
And so this Clean Electricity Performance Program moves us dramatically in that direction, which just makes sense. And without that, the chances of, as Denise says, the chances of success, it's the predominant. It has the biggest impact.
That's right.
Per dollar spent. And so again, if you care about fiscal responsibility, you ought to put the money where it's going to make a big difference.
Yeah. And the technology's just been amazing.
Absolutely.
I mean, just wrote a piece last week saying, my God, who would have imagined that we could move to renewables so quickly, and batteries and all the other technology that is necessary is just so rapidly developed, and again, it's not that we don't have the tools to do what we need to do.
Right.
It's the political will. It's the money to make it happen.
So Joe Manchin, the Republicans, they want to keep us on expensive coal, on expensive oil, and instead of letting us move to cheap solar and cheap wind, so we can't even compete then with other countries economically.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And they want to talk about the cost. 3.5 trillion. Well, you know what the cost is going to be if we don't do something? That's the cost of climate change. Yeah. I mean, Bill McKibben said there isn't that much money in the world.
That's right.
That the economic costs are going to be if we don't take the actions that we need to do. So, I mean, this is just an incredibly stupid and short-sighted approach, isn't it?
Yes. And again, here we are, though. So we could get one Republican. Let's put some blame again on our Republican colleagues. Sorry, we can, folks are mad at Manchin and Sinema, and I get it because we need every single vote you possibly can get if you're going to stick to any sort of standards. But at least Manchin's been consistent. I mean, there was no expectation in my mind from day one that this person, given this record and the politics of West Virginia and what they're doing right now. So where we're going to be, we're going to be in an executive order in 6 months from now that does the exact same thing that Obama tried to do again 10 years ago.
To be challenged in the courts.
And we'll be in that sort of mess again, right? How do we get to these votes? And this is we can't get to 60, right? On any other unless so we could go back to some of the other For the People acts and some of the other acts that are trying to change voting rights and trying to change filibuster is one way to get there. That takes another year and a half at minimum, right? And just to show you maybe the paucity of the executive orders. The only executive order that is going to happen out of the Biden administration is a methane rule. And we know methane is much more concentrated than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. And so, one of this kind of big bang for your buck ideas is to do this methane rule. It's got business and industry support because really all it is about is we could cut our methane emissions by about 30% by just fixing the existing leakages from pipes.
That's
and
the problem,
it's like, okay, let's invest. That's investment in fossil fuel industry is what my brain actually translates that into, right? That's what they're going to do, right? The little piddling around the edges stuff is what we're going to continue to do.
Emissions are going to do some things on
they're going to do
emissions.
right, exactly, and we've had those. We've tried to do those things. We know that these nationally determined contributions do not work. We know that we need, to go back to Christian Parente, why climate change will make you love big government. We're going to need some of these mandates if we're ever going to get there. And here we are rejecting again a plan that has been developed that we know will cut emissions significantly to what we need to do. We've been rejecting that same plan now for 10, 15 years.
And I want to come back to your first point. We used to have a democracy where, if you were a senator, you were going to, maybe vote your interests, but you're going to vote your principles to some extent. What you believe and what the people of your state believe. And sadly, that seems our democracy isn't doing that. That every one of our Republican senators, every one of our Republicans in the House of Representatives, not a single one of them is going to vote for either one of these bills.
Right.
Which, historically, this is not where the American democracy has been for most of our experience as a country. And, again, as a political scientist, I think climate change is overwhelmingly the biggest challenge that we face as a global community. But if we don't get our democracy back, if we don't, get a more functioning democracy, then that's another pretty fundamental issue.
That's our next show, I hope.
Yeah, we definitely have to come back and focus on that quite a bit. And again, it's just the problems seem intractable at this point in terms of, it's easy to not have any hope. McKibben's article last week said, what's giving me hope is that, the dramatic drop in prices and the availability of the technology here to do this. And lots of places are going forward without any federal leadership. A lot of places are starting to do this. And he talks about the social movement. He talks about, the incredible global social movement that has arisen. Greta and the kids are a part of that. That's right. But there's a tremendous worldwide movement, and how much power can that movement assert? You talk about the Sunrise young people out there trying to pressure the government, and so we've got this sort of tussle, and most of the power and the energy seems to be with the fossil fuel industry and the political leaders who are in their bed. But well, we only have 2 minutes left.
We have 2 minutes, so I want to come back to my earlier point, and that is to say, yes, we have a great social movement, but our social movement has not been that effective at channeling that energy into the key political issues that build that political power. And to me, that is the real challenge. Both how do we build that movement, but I think part of the way you build it is by getting smarter and by using that the incredible energy of the young people. I think we've got to bring in more middle class people to this and get them engaged in effective ways. But effective ways meaning looking at West Virginia, looking at Australia, looking at the key policies and issues and people where if we don't make these changes, we're not going to see the broader global changes that this depends on. Build that political power. That's my final statement.
Absolutely, and we need bills that open up voting access and rights at the national level to end gerrymandering, to have the actual public voice being representation, as you know, is the fundamental political question here. And I don't think many folks feel like they are being represented. There are ways to fix that system that we have to go back to. I will make one prediction. This will go to court, right? If you've still been following Juliana and those cases, the fundamental reason why the courts are backstopped on this is we're just waiting for the federal government to act because they have so much power. And the longer this goes on that, well, they're not doing anything either, we will see the power of the youth in the courts again, I think.
You think we'll see
I do.
Giuliani moving forward at some point then?
I do.
Well, that would be important and incredible
Yes.
if that would happen.
Good luck summing that up.
Well, it's hard to. So again, if people want to pay attention to COP26, it's going to start on the 31st of October. So early November is when most of the actions are going to happen, and it'll be important for us to kind of keep track of that. And if people want to get involved locally to work on this issue, we have the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. Denise, we have 1 minute for you to summarize and tell us.
Please, you can look me up if you're watching this program and you're not already part of the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. Please look up Denise Keele through Western Michigan University and shoot me an email, and we will get you involved in that local grassroots movement that is trying to change those things on the ground right here. And you can be any small or large part of any of those actions. November 6th is the day that's been identified from the international community as the protest day, if you will, for social movements for global climate justice. And the remarks you made about Glasgow and Scotland really make that kind of all come home. So maybe we'll try to do something for November 6th, but we are always doing something. We meet the second and fourth Fridays, and we are interested in that, moving that local action. So all the way from the international to right here in Kalamazoo, there's a way to make a difference.
All right. Thank you both. This has been great. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. We hope you come back and see us again. Thank you.